With Fontaine right around the corner and Kokomi and Wanderer's reruns being here, I wanted to give you guys a review on both of these characters, Kokomi and Wanderer, what to expect from them, talk about how good they are to your account, their pull value and overall strength, and things to consider before you do pull for them, basically helping you answer the question of should I pull for Kokomi and or Wanderer, or should I save up for Fontaine? Now obviously there's a lot of personal factors here, like your personal enjoyment of these characters and who you're most excited for, but I will be trying to cover everything I can in this video regarding the strength and weaknesses of these characters, their pull value overall, and whether I think you should pull or save. Now, as always though, before we begin, I do want you guys to know that I stream most nights on Twitch if you want to catch me live, so link in the description if you're interested. And with that being said, let's get right into it. All right, so starting things off, let's talk about Kokomi before moving on to Wanderer to address her value as a character, how strong she is, and whether or not you should go for her. Well, first of all, Kokomi's role is relatively straightforward, but also very versatile, as she can be used in many different teams. In fact, Kokomi's playstyles are as follows. You can either use her off-field or on-field, with her off-field role being a hydro applying healer, healing your team from off-field, dealing a bit of negligible damage outside of the buffs that she provides your team. In fact, she can consistently buff your team through supportive artifact sets like Tenacity of the Millith, Deepwood, or even Ocean Hued Clam, which is just like passive damage based on how much you're healing, while also giving you good healing through an elemental skill with good uptime, especially because you can refresh its duration with your burst, and providing you with other buffs such as the Thrilling Tales Catalyst. Kokomi therefore has a lot of good strengths even from off-field, on top of the fact that she's a healer, making her a very valuable sort of 2-in-1 in many teams that want hydro and a healer. If that wasn't enough, she can also be used since the release of Dendro in Dendro teams, more specifically Bloom teams, like basically any team where you want hydro application. Kokomi can be a good 2-in-1 healer, provided you want like slow hydro, which can be really good with certain aggravate carries, or can be used as a Bloom procer in Nilou Bloom teams, where you can stack full elemental mastery on her, a offensive EM set and an EM weapon, as you guys can see, have a ton of elemental mastery, and then deal over 30,000 damage on every Bloom when paired with Nilou. She is usually the best option in these teams, being an upgrade to Barbara because she gives you good healing while also having really good damage, as a character who can stack elemental mastery fully, have ownership of the Blooms, and let your Nilou build HP instead of looking for EM. If that wasn't enough, Kokomi can even be used on field in some of the teams that I just mentioned, but also as a driver for taser teams where you're running electro characters with her, or for certain Dendro teams as well, like Burgeon or Hyperbloom, if you want someone on field to heal you but also apply a ton of hydro. Her hydro application from off-field is slow, but enough, like a nice bonus, which she makes up for by giving you good buffs and healing, and then on-field she has high hydro application if you want a driver who will do like basically less damage than an Ayato, but make up for it by giving you healing, so she can be a really good option in many of those teams, either on or off-field. If that wasn't enough, despite Kokomi being good since she first came out, despite being misunderstood and undervalued, she's gotten a lot better with a lot of new things, like new characters she can synergize with, notably Dendro teams and Nilou, but also hydro characters like Yelan and the new Hydro Resonance, where you can sort of run them together in certain teams, with the new Hydro Resonance buffing your HP, increasing your damage and healing. We also got the Ocean Hued Clam set, and new content like the Last Abyss, which was really punishing, to where having a healer or even more than one healer can be nice to make sure you don't just instantly die in teams that otherwise with less healing or no healer at all. Kokomi, in my opinion, is a very comfy character who provides a lot of value as a consistent option whenever you would want off-field or on-field hydro. Her weaknesses are that from off-field, her hydro application isn't as fast, and there are some teams that don't really need her or where she can be replaced. In Nilou Bloom teams, for example, while she is the best option, you can also just use Barbara, who will have less uptime, but can still be perfectly fine in that team. And the same can be said in, for example, Freeze teams, where you can use Mona instead of Kokomi. Now, again, I really think Kokomi is oftentimes the best options in teams like these, but she isn't someone who is like absolutely game-changing, as certain other upgrades to your account may be more worthwhile. I am someone who does love Kokomi and her comfort though, as her rotations are a lot more comfy than using Mona or Barbara. From on-field, Kokomi can also make her way in many teams where you want a healer, but won't be the best option if you already have one. For example, if you're running EM Raiden as your Hyperbloom driver, who has really fast electro application on her elemental skill, Kokomi can be your best option as a healer and hydro driver. With that in mind, if you're using the more common Kuki, who is already a healer, you might be better off using someone like Ayato instead of Kokomi, as you may not need the extra healing. And so in that regard, Kokomi can be replaceable in teams if you already have a healer, already have other hydro options. I believe the strength of each individual hydro 5-star character goes up based on how few others you have. In fact, the more hydro 5-stars you have, the less the other ones become valuable. Like for example, if you already have Mona, then you may not need to pull for Kokomi for freeze. If you already have Ayato and Child and Yelan, you may not need an extra hydro character, but she can definitely be worth getting if either you don't have a bunch of other hydro characters or want her in the teams where she shines the most, like some Dendro Bloom teams, or as a slow hydro applier in Quick Bloom, or in freeze teams where she usually is undeniably the best option. She can also be worth a get just for comfort as someone who can heal without needing their elemental burst, and who can be very satisfying to play, especially if you like the character. For some other strengths that I think I should mention though, I want to say that her builds are very flexible or variable based on what you're doing. For example, in Bloom teams, you can stack full EM on either Gilded Dreams, Flower of Paradise, or just mix and matching 2P sets going on substats. Tenacity of the Millith being great as the go-to supportive option, giving you attack percent and a set that most support characters can't use. Like, yeah, we've been getting more characters that can use the set as new characters get released, but it's still a really good supportive set that Kokomi can use and a lot of other healers can't. Or even 4-piece Deepwood in certain Dendro teams where you may not want to run this on your Dendro character who may be doing damage, and where Kokomi can kind of just run this, reduce the Dendro res of enemies from off-field passively without needing to think too much of it. This is especially true in something like a Burgeon team where you may want to give your Dendro character another set like Instructor on Yao Yao or Gilded Dreams on Nahida. And another strength of Kokomi is that even just the stats you're looking for are a lot more common or basically just not crit, so it can be easier to build her than other characters. What I mean by this is for a standard like healer build, you're looking for HP and maybe healing bonus, as well as some energy recharge, which yeah, can be hard to get if that's just what you're looking for, but you also will be getting a lot of excess pieces of these if you're just farming for whatever set you're looking for passively. With Kokomi, just make sure you have enough ER to use your burst, which really depends on your team. It can be like 160 to 200, but that varies. And then go for either HP as a healer or EM as a bloom procer, and you can really get a lot of value without needing to like optimize her too much, as she obviously is someone who can't use crit because of the way her passive talents work. Kokomi also has an amazing free-to-play weapon option with the Thrilling Tales for just the generic off-field support Kokomi, but also on-field because it gives you HP. It's not even a bad option as long as you can use the buff. Make it just a really amazing go-to HP catalyst, even sometimes better than her signature, at least from off-field, where I really don't recommend pulling for the donut. Like, genuinely, Thrilling Tales is so amazing on her, with there also being other options like Hakushin Ring from on-field in an Electra team, or using an EM catalyst, which is what I would recommend more if you are playing her in a Bloom team and are stacking Elemental Mastery on her. Then going for something like Sack Frags, which is also a 4-star catalyst, is a great option. Even something like Prototype Amber can be okay if you want HP and energy, and there really are just so many free-to-play options or 4-star options for Kokomi to where you can always get a good weapon and a good build on her, provided you just farm a bit and level her to 90 to increase your scalings. This is really important to give her more HP as a healer, but also way more bloom damage if you are playing her in a Nilou team, where going from level 80 to 90 is like over a 30% DPS increase to all of your blooms. With that in mind, for Kokomi's teams, there really is so much you can do. Kokomi is great in many teams, either from off-field or on-field, like notably Nilou bloom teams, Hyper bloom teams, or Quick bloom teams, where you can use her either from on or off-field, depending on your team, as a 2-in-1 Hydro healer. She can also be used in Burgeon teams, Freeze teams, again as a really powerful 2-in-1, Mono Hydro, and also on-field in a Taser or Electrocharge team if you need a healer on top of the more standard Xingqiu Beidou teams. You can also technically use her in some Vaporized teams with characters like Xiangling, although she's not as recommended because you usually have Bennett as a healer as well. And you can also use her just as a generic healer whenever you need one with basically any carry, provided you can either use the Hydro or it doesn't hurt you. Now moving on, let's talk about Wanderer and his pull value and place in the meta overall. Well, Wanderer is a pretty decent anemo carry who can serve basically two main roles. He can either be used as a hyper carry when paired with Faruzan, especially if she has her C6, other buffing supports like Bennett and even Toma who can give you a shield, Pyro Resonance, his C6 that increases your normal and charge attack damage, or just a flex support. While that's not his only hyper carry team, it is the main go-to one, especially because of how much C6 Faruzan can help Skara to carry your team. With that in mind, you can also use Skara as just an on-field driver in many teams where you otherwise would use someone like Sucrose or Hazo. In fact, since Skara is an Anemo Catalyst, not only will all of his attacks be Anemo, but also he can run the Verdescent Venerer set, which will give him some personal damage by increasing his Anemo damage by 15% and giving a bit of buffs to his swirl, while also and primarily buffing the damage of anything that you're swirling. And if you are playing a Taser team or like a Freeze team or anything where you can swirl multiple elements, then you can get a lot of value from the set. You can pair Skara with characters that deal really high amounts of off-field damage, like Xingqiu, Beidou, Yelan, Fischl, any of those characters for an Electrocharge team, or the same Hydro characters but with someone maybe like Rosaria or Kaya if you plan on freezing, or even Xiangling in Pyro reaction teams. While Skara is replaceable in this role, and Sucrose is oftentimes about as good and usually a bit better, he can still hold his ground here and be a good on-field driver who has much more personal damage. On top of that, you can also use him, as I said, in a situation where I believe he shines more as this hyper carry who can use his skill, spam either normal or charge attacks, or typically a mix of both, with 2 normals into a charge attack being his generic combo for a decent amount of single target and AoE damage, being the main source of damage in your team, which again, I feel like he's kind of made as a carry character, but in that role, he's a bit more dependent on Faruzan, especially C6 Faruzan, not entirely dependent, but wants her to really be competitive with other carries and to really feel as strong as he should be. But even without that, he's still a pretty decent carry and a honestly good driver as well, who also comes with a lot of convenience, like being able to just be insane for exploration if that's something you care about, as you can just dash around everywhere and float very high. Do keep in mind though that when building a Wanderer team, you oftentimes want a shield. Now you don't always need it, but it really helps him be more comfy, because when you're in the air, you can get like displaced or knocked around if you get hit a single time, and sometimes you don't want to dash inside of your skill if you don't have your passive procced. So having a shield can make him a lot more comfy to play, especially if you're on like high ping or whatever. It can just be a nice thing to have, which is why running characters like Toma, Layla, Zhongli, or a freeze team can almost feel necessary at times and really help make Wanderer feel a lot more comfy, so you don't have to waste any of your skill stamina bar dodging. Another strength and weakness at the same time of Wanderer is actually Faruzan. Now, while I touched on her already in this video, or at least mentioned her, you need to understand that what she does drastically changes based on if you have her C6 or not. Now, even at C0, I think Faruzan is still a functional support and one that I recommend using to most Chao players and to hyper carry Wanderer teams, but with the main caveat being that you need like 300 energy recharge or close to that amount, like 250 to 300, to actually be able to burst consistently on her depending on how you use her. She gives you a 30% anemo resistance decrease while also giving you some anemo damage bonus, some decent personal damage, and also another buff thanks to her passive talent. And while all this is good, you really just need to have your burst active to have literally any of these effects, while also having very terrible energy generation. Like, you don't really want to use your skill if you don't have to, or at least charge shot with it, because it wastes time. But when you do, that's the only time that you get particles on Faruzan. It's after you use your skill and then use your charge shot on an enemy or on the ground. That is when you're going to generate energy, and it really isn't even a big amount. Faruzan also has a 80 energy cost burst, making it really hard for her to get her burst back if you are C0. With that in mind, you can still stack energy recharge on literally every piece and usually be fine, but it's not just that. It's also that without her constellations, you not only lose out on uptime, 6 seconds of it, but also lose out on some energy generation, which you get at your C4, and then C6 just gives you way more stuff, increasing the crit damage of your anemo damage by 40%, making characters like Wanderer a lot more powerful. If that wasn't enough, this C6 also just will proc your skill every 3 seconds, and this skill proc will not only count as skill damage, allowing you to run the Tenacity of the Millith set to, again, buff your Wanderer even more, but also will just generate energy for you passively throughout your burst. Oh, and I almost forgot to add that because you're spamming your skill inside of your C6, like it's passively using your skill's effect every 3 seconds, you're also grouping enemies, because that's what your skill does. Like, the shot of it will kind of group enemies and displace them. So your C6 will also give your Faruzan some grouping, which is just another thing to add on to everything that you're gaining from having her constellations. So while this C6, the first part, can resemble Sara's C2, the second part just gives you a ton of energy by proccing your skill all the time, and basically makes it to where this C6 has so many different effects that changes Faruzan to a different character. I genuinely believe that with her C2, C4, and C6, Faruzan with constellations is not at all the same character as Faruzan C0. With that in mind, Faruzan C0 is still a fine support for Wanderer, and one that I recommend in hypercarry teams, but not so much in the off-field driver variations, and at C0, both of these are perfectly viable. If you do have Faruzan C6 though, a carrying Wanderer team becomes much more relevant, and you can start to deal pretty big amounts of damage. With that in mind, Skara also has some pretty decent upgrades you can go for, with notably his second constellation being quite good, because if you get your first and your second one, you will get insane amounts of burst damage if you can time it correctly with your C2, using your burst at the very end of your elemental skill, while also gaining some attack speed and some more passive damage through your first constellation. Other things to note about Skara is that actually his A4 passive, which I haven't really talked about yet, gives him a free dash inside of his skill, where you're floating in the air doing some normal and charge attacks, and then you can dash passively as you see these things behind you light up without consuming any of your special like skill stamina bar. This means that you can reposition and dodge once you have this active, although you do need to kind of pay attention to this and learn how to use this efficiently to time your dodges when you have a free one up to avoid attacks and reposition. Now, with that in mind, to talk more about Wanderer's strengths and weaknesses, I do want to admit that he is a pretty decent carry in general. Like, he gets better with C6 Faruzan, who also has grouping, which can help alleviate Wanderer's like charge attacks, sometimes ungrouping enemies, and he can get a lot of value there, but he can also be okay as just a driver with normal off-field supports. And by normal, I mean like a very wide array of them being viable, which we'll see when I talk about teams very shortly, where you can basically fit him with so many different characters and so many different teams, and he can perform decently if he's a character that you like and want to use as a main DPS. Also, it's worth noting that if you are playing Wanderer without his second constellation, you are typically going to be using your burst every 2 rotations, because you don't want to be building energy recharge on him, or at least not a lot of it, because it's a waste of damage compared to if you build crit and attack percent. So typically you just use your burst whenever you have it at the start of your rotation before using your skill, which is generally once every 2 rotations, where it's a good amount of damage but not the main part of your kit, which is something to keep in mind if you do want to get the most value out of him. You don't want to be building way too much energy recharge. It's also worth noting that since Skara has this passive talent that gives him some bonuses based on what elements you're running. This can greatly influence the different types of teams you can play with him, whereas you can get a bunch of attack if you're playing him with pyro characters, or at least are swirling pyro. Same with if you're swirling cryo in like a freeze team, where you can get a bunch of inherent crit rate, and makes it to where, again, Skara can get many different buffs based on what elements you're using, making his teams that much more flexible, because he does have good synergy with a lot of different, for example, hydro characters, pyro characters, and also cryo ones. Keep in mind though, I really do want to emphasize that I think Wander is someone who does get better with a lot of upgrades. While yes, even at C0, he is a pretty strong carry. I want to emphasize that he is decently strong. He's fine. He's a good option, but especially upgrades like C6 Faruzan, which isn't mandatory, but is definitely a big increase in damage and definitely makes Skara feel more complete as a character, while also getting a ton of value from upgrades like his second constellation and a good weapon, which can make it a lot more rewarding to use Wander. And so I know this section's a bit all over the place because he's just a main DPS. Obviously Wander and main DPS characters in general that aren't game breaking aren't going to have the same pull value as a highly flexible support like Kokomi, but it's still just good enough. Like, definitely a pretty decently strong character. Honestly, not game breaking, not bad. If it's someone who you want to get and want to use as a main DPS, you'll find good value out of them. Again, depending on the supports you have and the builds you have, the teams you're running, all that, but definitely a fine DPS, just not one that you should feel kind of forced to get, although they do have the upside of being really fun to explore with, which is something to consider, I guess. Before moving on, I did want to mention that Wander does also have very high flexibility in their builds, both artifact and weapon wise. Starting with your weapons, please don't pull on the new weapon banner. It's so bad. Like, unless you really want Wander or Kokomi's weapons, which again, both are not recommended. Kokomi, just use Thrilling Tales or another option that I mentioned, and Wander usually has options that are similar in strength, sometimes better if you're not just normal attack spamming, to where you really shouldn't pull on this weapon banner because it's probably one of the worst weapon banners like ever. Wander's signature weapon is good for him, generally his best in slot, but it's just not as big of a DPS increase as a lot of other signature weapons are for their specific character compared to other options. On top of that, it forces you to spam normal attacks instead of charge attacking, as it primarily just buffs your normal attacks, so still a good option, but not as big of an upgrade as some other signature weapons are. Because of that, any of the generic 5 stars like Lost Prayer or Skyward Atlas, or even any of the other limited ones that give you either crit or like attack percent, are all really good on him. Any of the 5-star options you have, provided they don't give you like HP, all being a similar in strength and just a good option. If that wasn't enough, you also have good 4 stars, like genuinely Widsith is really insane if you can make use of its effect, have good time on it, and it's also something that gets better with refinement. But you could also use something like Dodoko Tails, an old event weapon, Solar Pearl, again mostly for normal attacking, or even one of the free-to-play 4 stars that you can craft. Because of that, he has really a ton of weapon options that aren't that far behind his signature, especially like high refinement 4 stars, or just any of the like standard catalysts that you may already have. Artifact wise, again, he is very flexible. You can't just go the standard like Verdescent Venerer, on-field driver, damage dealing support at the same time, kind of like a Sucrose or a Hazo if you are playing that type of team. And then if you're running him as a hyper carry, then you would want to either go for one of the following sets, either the Desert Pavilion, which is his sort of signature best in slot set, but since the domain isn't that efficient to farm, like, yeah, go ahead and do it. If you want to main Skara, feel free to get this set, and it is his best in slot. But if not, you may have better substats on something like Reminiscence, which is a very efficient domain, which is not that far behind and gives you a ton of stats. The only downside of this set is that you lose some energy when you use your skill, so you may need a little bit of energy recharge, or you may have to use your burst, sometimes even every 3 rotations. So keep that in mind. It makes you burst a bit less, but it's still worth it, gives you a ton of normal and charge attack damage, and also some attack percent. With that in mind, you can also go Echoes of an Offering if you're spamming normal attacks, or mix and match like literally any 2 pieces, and just go based on substats, and your Wanderer can just do good damage even without needing like a specific set, as long as you have good stats for him. He's relatively flexible in that regard, or actually very flexible, and a lot of the times if you're running high damage dealing elemental supports, you can also just go for Verdescent Venerer until you have whatever set you're going for him and his personal damage. This can also be the best in slot in teams where your off-field supports do more or do a significant amount of your damage, and you're not running another support, another Anemo character like Faruzan who could run the Verdescent Venerer set. Now for the teams you're going to be running with Wanderer, as I said, here it's split into 2. Either you're playing him as a hyper carry or as a driver. Now for the hyper carry variation, I typically recommend running him with Faruzan, especially C6 Faruzan. Again, a huge upgrade, but even if you're C0, C2, or C4, you can still use her as a good option, although she's a bit less mandatory. From that point onwards, you can run basically 2 flex options after that. Typically, I recommend running elements that Wanderer synergize with and supports that he synergizes with, so you can do things like running shield characters like Toma or Layla, and then you can run a healer there of an element that you want to kind of make synergies. Like a lot of times you can run 2 pyro with Wanderer and Faruzan. For example, this team you're seeing right here. You can also run some freeze variations with a hydro and a cryo. Again, if you want a shield, you can use someone like Layla. You can also do some double hydro things. You can play electro supports like Fischl as well, or you could also run some triple Anemo teams, which I really like, both with C0 or with C6 Faruzan, as with C0, the third anemo character will give you more energy, and then with C6, while that is still true, you will also get way more damage on your other anemo character because of how Faruzan's buffs work. Because of that, you can run a character like Venti or Kazuha offensively to group enemies and deal really good damage, and in this team, you can even put Kazuha on like crit, as the EM bonus isn't really relevant here, so you can literally just focus on his damage, and you can have a really powerful team. This other anemo character can also group enemies for your Wanderer, while also providing you with good damage. You can also run Jean in this team and play Jean Sunfire, where she'll self-swirl the pyro that your Bennett is giving you. For a hypercarry Wanderer, there's really so much you can do. You don't need Faruzan, but I do recommend running her. You can use characters like Bennett for a bunch of buffs, triple anemo teams, which are my personal favorite, or teams where you're also running a shield like Bennett with Toma, whose strengths include giving you a lot of energy through Favonius Lance and also his skill, the Pyro Resonance when paired with Bennett, a strong shield for your Wanderer to be comfy and not vulnerable, while also giving you some normal and charge attack damage if you have his 6 constellation, which is very relevant. With that in mind, Layla can also give you some good value as a shielder who can also give you some buffs if you do plan on playing Wanderer in a freeze team, which also can be quite comfy. Outside of a hyper carry though, you can also play Wanderer, as I said, as an on-field driver with pretty much any good elemental support, assuming the team makes sense and can proc valuable reactions. I'll put a bunch of examples on screen now of just some good teams that you can run, again, both with or without Faruzan, depending on your playstyle and who you want to play. For comfort, you can run a shield, but just run reactions that make sense that you can swirl, and you'll generally have a good time, with my personal favorite teams being triple anemo, the Toma Bennett double pyro, or a Wanderer freeze team for comfort. All right, so with all that said, let's wrap things up and answer the question of should you pull for Wanderer or Kokomi, or should you save for Fontaine? Now, before I give you guys my honest answer, I do want to say that obviously it depends. It depends on who you like, what you're trying to go for, what characters you have on your account, and how replaceable the options are for you. With that in mind, here's what I genuinely believe. I want to start by saying that I think Kokomi is a pretty almost future-proof unit in a way, in the sense that she's just very versatile and good for most people. Now, if you already have a ton of Hydro options and don't need another one, then you can skip her. But I also believe that if you want a Hydro healer and have teams where you can use one, she is definitely a direct upgrade to Barbara, who is still fine, but Kokomi's better, applies Hydro, heals for you, can be used as a driver, and is just a good addition to your account. This is why I believe that Kokomi is a high value pull, again, depending on what characters you have, but provided you don't have like literally every Hydro character already and can use her as an upgrade in a team where she shines, I think Kokomi is a great healer and a great support. For Wanderer, I think he's a pretty strong and decent DPS, not one who is needed or that you should feel forced to get, but one who can carry his weight and does get stronger, as I said, with some key upgrades, key supports, and when being played properly. I think Wanderer is one of the most fun characters to explore with, as you don't need your burst to deal damage and you can zoom around everywhere, so keep in mind your enjoyment, as well as if you want a DPS character, you want to make sure that you're sticking with them and it's someone that you like, on top of just being viable and capable of clearing the hardest content, which again he is capable of, provided you are playing and building him correctly. He does have weaknesses like being very vulnerable when he's in the air, having some weird auto targeting at times, and also being replaceable, but as a main DPS, because he is strong enough, you can use him if he's a character that you like, feel happy to pull for him if you plan on using him as your main carry or just on-field driver, as his playstyle is very unique. He has a pretty good AoE, and as I said, gains a lot of value with Faruzan and also with just these key upgrades that we've talked about. So I'm trying to include as much nuance as I can here, because my thoughts on DPS characters has always been pull for the ones you like, assuming they can clear the end game content, which is the Abyss, and Wanderer can definitely do that. Despite him not being the most meta character, he's still, in my opinion, a pretty strong option if he's a character that you like and can play and build properly. With that in mind, especially if you're free to play, you do need to realize that Fontaine's coming with a lot of cool characters that will probably be good. Like, they're probably going to release new strong characters like the Hydro Archon and a lot of the other cool ones that we saw. So keep that in mind. Ask yourself who you want and if you can save enough Primogems for them before pulling on these banners. There's just a balance that I have to strike between talking about a character's strengths and weaknesses, while also including my personal feelings about the character, and also emphasizing the fact that, hey, there's a brand new region coming out soon, so I want to avoid overhyping anyone or making people pull for a character that they'd regret when there's a ton of new characters right around the corner. So just really make sure that the playstyle of the character you're going for, either Wanderer or Kokomi, is something that you want, that you will enjoy, and that you will be using and won't regret. I hope I didn't ramble too long in this video. I hope this isn't too long because I didn't want to make it that long. Also, ignore why my Bennett's on num enter. I don't want to talk about it, but those are my thoughts on these characters. Kokomi and Wanderer are both dear to my heart. I just like them. I genuinely play both all the time, but I also think that they're not characters you absolutely need. So I hope I give you guys a good pro and con of both, the flexible support that is Kokomi and the DPS that is Wanderer, so that you can make an informed decision. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and as always, I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace.